discussion this morning, and I imagine that a lot of the questions that were raised will probably find their way into the discussion in the afternoon. So, under the auspices of what I was calling techniques, the aesthetics of communication, I was very interested in the kind of range of techniques that each of the participants was using to communicate difficult or otherwise kind of visible aspects of the way stream. I was also interested in the kind of audiences that they spoke to, as well as the kind of positions from which they spoke in terms of how they imagined themselves as kind of actors who are part of kind of larger institutions, or small institutions, or singular institutions in some cases, which engage with these kind of large-scale systems of shopping carts. Kind of documentary project that Julian has also imagined in new settings, which he will discuss. And also joining us is Kenny Cooper from Buffalo School of Architecture and Planning.
So my name is Rosten. I live in Los Angeles now. I'm a sort of, as described, I'm sort of what have you. I do some writing, I do some design. Almost all of my work has to do with helping people situate themselves within large and complex systems. Most of my work is done in long-term collaboration with a lot of different types of people, including other designers, community organizers, educators, folks like that. So I do a lot of things, but probably the thing I'm best at doing is putting together projects with a lot of other people and a lot of other parts. So I just sort of assemble things. So like here's some stuff I've done. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. So what I am going to talk about, I took the prompt that I was given very literally. So I'm going to talk about a project that is about 10 years old. I haven't talked about it in quite a while, and this set of slides is actually pretty old as well. So there might be small points where I'm like shaky on the detail here or there. But I'm basically just going to tell a story about a project that I did with an organization that I co-founded called the Center for Pedagogy. We did this project in 2002. It was, in some ways, the first project that we did. We did this project as we got our nonprofit status. So, So I'm going to tell this project kind of as more of like as a narrative of people figuring things out, more than as like a finished work of art that I'm presenting to you. So the project was called Garbage Problems at its completion, and it came out of, at that time I was like 22, and started assembling income through a lot of different sources, amongst them doing some freelance journalism. And I was given an assignment to write about a design competition that was sponsored by the city called Fresh Kills, Landfill to Landscape. And it was a partnership between the Municipal Art Society and the Department of City Planning. And it was a multi-million-dollar international design competition, and sort of put together with the people I might expect attending such a thing. And so I was asked to sort of write, really at that point, just like a kind of short, it was from Metropolis magazine, so you can imagine kind of like what kind of piece they wanted. So design, it's awesome. Look at these cool designs. So the reason why this competition was being done at all was because the city had closed Fresh Kills. Fresh Kills is, I'm back on the East Coast, everyone knows what Fresh Kills is. It was, the world's largest landfill. It, visible from space, has a lot of various kinds of iconic status. It was something that Julian, when he won his re-election, one of his campaign promises to Staten Island, which was one of his kind of his like stronghold, was that he would close Fresh Kills. He was like, I will, just straight up. And so, kind of as a lame duck move, like just before leaving office, he did indeed close Fresh Kills. And sort of the public face of the closing of Fresh Kills was this competition. Like, this is going to be so awesome. We're going to get, we're not losing a landfill, we're gaining a park, was kind of the big kind of push. So that is design competition. And the team that won, as probably everyone here was field operations. And this is just an image rendering from the winning proposal. I love, for a lot of reasons, I haven't seen it in a while, but man, it's crazy. And the conceit, which was very smart, and was that, and the conceit with which they won the design competition was, well, you know what, like, you can't plan a park for Fresh Kills right now because it's going to settle over the course of 30 years. There's going to be all these different kinds of, like, we don't even know what the contour of the land will be. And by the time that contour of the land is settled enough to build, we don't even know what people will even want to do in the park. And so one of their big points was, like, 20 years ago, like, no one thought that skateboarding was cool. And now, like, that's all anybody wants to build in an urban center is a skate park. That's like the #1 requested feature. So who knows what someone's going to want in 30 years? And so it would be foolish for us to even propose a passive or active recreational use for this site 30 years in advance. And that is, in fact, probably like the smartest, most correct thing you could do in response to a design prompt to design something for a site that is sinking over the course of 30 years, and is in the meantime getting completely or partially extremely toxic. So the kind of like the broader point that this competition entry and the competition itself sort of raises then is, well, why are you holding a design competition for a site that cannot really be designed for? And you're going to select as the winner someone who's basically saying, like, actually, you cannot design for this. And the reason for it is obvious, what seemed clear to me is that it was political. Like, it's much easier to close, it's much easier to reopen a landfill than site a new one. For us, like New York City has a history over the last, 150 years of closing landfills, and then 3 years later being like, oh fuck, what are we going to do with the garbage? We're reopening the landfill because we cannot figure out anywhere else within the city to site a landfill because, for reasons of people don't want to live next to a landfill. Whereas if people are sort of used to it already, it's just politically easier to reopen. So in this way, design and architecture as a profession was being really mobilized as a kind of smokescreen, as a way to kind of politically close a landfill that, could not really be closed. So to kind of transfer into the public imagination this site that is clearly a landfill into this park and kind of start investing hundreds of millions of dollars into the idea that there's a park there before you can actually break ground. So it's kind of like a conceptual groundbreaking. And so in the meantime, what was happening is that the city actually had no long-term plan for its garbage at all. And it was basically shipping the waste out by diesel truck in a way that was pretty uncoordinated, of like sort of like on a month-to-month basis, sort of like, well, who's going to take it now? Like, and just kind of bidding that out. And so it was kind of a disastrous lack of any sort of long-term plan. It was costing the city, I think it was, they were like this estimated figure, it was costing like the city $1 million per day to kind of like running the operation as it was. So at that point, sort of at the very beginnings of working with CUP, we were trying to figure out, well, what's kind of a more interesting, more productive way that we as kind of people interested in design and as designers could engage with Fresh Kills. Don't show that one yet. Okay. So I'll stay on this one. And so what we decided to do was, at that particular moment, what CUP was going to be was really unclear to us at that point. We kind of produced a couple of exhibitions. We had built relationships with a couple of different schools. And we knew a teacher at an alternative school called City As School. It's like a last chance high school for students who otherwise would have just dropped out entirely. Who wanted, he was like, oh, you guys are doing such interesting work, could you figure out some way to work with our students? So we said we would sort of try to do, build an exhibition with these high school students and involve them in that way. So, in fact, there is quite a bit of public education about waste infrastructure in a way. This is an image from New York City's recycling campaign, which was like an $18 million project that they hired a marketing firm to come up with these characters. The guy up in the right seems trashy. And so quite a bit of money is actually spent in a way on kind of public education about waste infrastructure. But almost all of it is kind of in this model of kind of like citizen education. Oh no, it's missing. Okay. So, and the citizen education, where all you really need to know about waste infrastructure is, how to sort out your garbage. That's as far as they kind of really want to take it. And there's this book by William Rathje called Rubbish that I don't know if you assigned it to your students, or it's a fantastic book, but he makes a great point in there that most recycling programs are actually, recycling is a kind of a multi-step operation. The first step is kind of like sorting out the pieces. There's another part that would be collecting those resources. The third part that would be melting them down to some sort of raw material and so on and so forth. But almost all of the money that the city spends on recycling is just on that first step. Right? So they teach everyone how to sort materials. And then what actually happens to those, it's like, the less you know, the better. Right? And at that particular time also, this is in 2002, the city had actually decided to suspend its recycling program too as a fiscal measure. So it was a moment where there's kind of like a lot of like, poor planning, I guess you might say, around this. So we ran a semester-long education program in this high school. This is our little recruiting poster. This is our team. And the way it sort of became eventually kind of like a very standard component of the way CUP works, about half of its programming now is in schools doing what we call urban investigations. But this was sort of the first one, and we were kind of just sort of meandering out as we could. And kind of the basic philosophy is that, the construction of our exhibitions up to that point, the way we produce a lot of this idea of kind of trying to produce a social portrait of an issue in the city and assembling all the stakeholders around that issue. And we sort of, most of those things we approach, extremely naively. We have old building codes, we knew nothing about building codes. We tried to talk to everyone we thought might have some interesting viewpoint on building code, ranging from, the super of our building to I don't know, Michael Sorkin, to someone who works at the Department of Records, and try to just assemble how do all these people interact in this one thing. We figured, well, that's a decent way to actually just run a course with students, and we learned a lot in that process. We'll just do that with our students. So we took them out to all these different folks, trying to figure out where did our garbage go. And it was an earnest question because that one we did not know, and actually it wasn't known in the city. Actually, it wasn't something that was publicized that there was what exactly we did with our garbage. So we went out and talked to a lot of different folks. So amongst them, people who worked in materials recycling facilities. This guy is Timothy Logan, who worked with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We talked to people at the Department of Sanitation, people who were a part of this thing called CRABS, the Community Recycling Advisory Board. We got a lot of really good acronyms. That thing that he's holding there on the table is called the SWAMP, the Solid Waste Management Plan. And basically, ended up just doing, teaching students how to do, rudimentary documentation of sites and people, and then just doing all these interviews. And we kind of found this sort of magical thing happen when bringing students out to do kind of these interviews, especially with city bureaucrats and people who in general kind of having the kind of obfuscatory role in terms of public engagement, is that we could actually get way better and more access to people by saying we were with a bunch of high school students. And the high school students could actually ask much more blunt and direct questions. And we were like, oh, this is actually we're going to make a better exhibition because we're like, enlisting all these kind of young truth seekers. And so there was this kind of amazing thing that became very funny to push the rest of our kind of research process. And we also just a lot of just going around and trying to visit sites, visit transfer stations, visit materials recycling facilities, and so on. This is sort of a little map of all of the different things that we, the people that we talked to, and the things that we did. At this point, the project was, the only funding we had for the project was the radio station Hot 97 had donated this, in retrospect, it's foolish, but they donated this beautiful Trident 24-track mixing board to the city of school that was sitting in a basement. And the school was like, well, if you can figure out some way to sell that, you can use that money. So I sold it on eBay for $8,000, and that was the extent of my funding for this project. So then in the second half of the semester, we sort of took all this stuff back and tried to produce something with it that would engage with the And at this point, we didn't necessarily have a clear sense of where everything would go, but we made a lot of contacts with people at Sustainable Sound Bronx, people in the Environmental Justice Alliance, people who were interested in having some sort of media representation of the issues that they were dealing with. So one of the things that we found, this is one of the students' posters. His dad was a super in this building in the upper. So this is his building in Greenpoint here, and this is the local waste transfer station there. So we actually kind of rode along with the garbage truck and figured out where the waste transfer station was. Then talking to people at the environmental justice lines down to that middle map, we sort of got a sense of how that fit into the larger waste transfer station systems in New York. Okay, wow, look at that. Okay, so yeah, so here's this building, here's the transfer station, here's that transfer station, Greenpoint. That's not Greenpoint, that's in Red. And then here are the transfer stations in New York City. And probably many of you here have some sense of these. A lot of those transfer stations tend to be clustered in a few neighborhoods. So even though the kind of the cost of that environmental burden of garbage really is shouldered really disproportionately to places. So in South Bronx and in Greenpoint, yeah, and then basically in Greenpoint, and it's just over this way in Queens. So, sorry. Okay. So this is sort of like one of the products of that research. And kind of pulling together basically an environmental justice story about how in those two neighborhoods, as again probably here you probably are very aware, there's really disproportionate citation and asthma cases in a lot of particular matter because every single transit station kind of necessitates 4 truck trips. So the local truck goes in, drops off the trash, leaves. Then the kind of the long haul truck comes in, picks up the trash, and leaves. So every load of garbage is actually like 4 diesel truck trips. And so if you imagine that, going in, day out, essentially, for the most part, in 2 neighborhoods in all of New York City to deal with all of that trash, it's a lot of particular matter going into the air. And then up here, just to kind of complete it, this is where our garbage actually was being sent out to the landfills that we were sending out to. So another student tried to kind of make a map of all the decision making of who's in sort of like the garbage machine, like who makes decisions. So there's a map of both sort of like this kind of standard hierarchical map of the mayor and city council and the Department of Sanitation, and then we kind of try to place all the people we talk to. So we at this particular point, there's actually this really funny side story. There's 2 different places in New Jersey that were vying to become the dump that would replace Fresh Kills. And because they wanted to get the host community fee. And it's sort of a disastrous thing for that community, but it's, in a way, it seemed like a good revenue source. So we actually, I guess, in retrospect, broke a bunch of laws taking students to New Jersey, which we didn't realize was illegal at the time, to do these interviews with people who worked for ground affairs industries who had these different ideas of how they would build these transfer stations, and the mayor of Linden, New Jersey, who months after we finished the project was arrested for mob activity. So we produced these posters. Some of the students, this sort of became another kind of like standard feature of the way that we ran our projects, is that you're really trying to start with and accept student cynicism and people in general cynicism about politics in the world. So to this day, a large part of what we try to do is get people to be civically engaged, have a sense of entitlement and a sense of understanding of how they might fit into a governmental system. But we never try to do that in a way that assumes at the beginning that you have to have this positive orientation towards government or towards the world or towards the fact that the world is in the way that we have to be. In fact, trying to really work with the opposite of that feeling. So we had some goth kind of students who really like to spend their time when we were doing sort of like warm-up exercises, kind of drawing like what are the worst possible things that we can think about with garbage. And they were really engaging with the material. This is a drawing of a leachate drainage system and like a mutated fish, because it's swimming in this leachate pool, which are all things that are real. This is a Grim Reaper walking around in an incineration field. So we kind of started to accumulate all these kind of like weird, dark visions of how garbage works in the world, and we tried to figure out how we could build something out of them. came up with this kind of like, either this or a very large poster that we called, landfill versus incinerator. So on the one hand, we have sort of these wedges between these like kind of two technical diagrams. Here's how a landfill works, and here's how the line works. Here's an incinerator, here's like how like the scrubber tubes work, So there's sort of like these key diagrams. In the middle, there's sort of this other diagram that is of all the kind of like costs and benefits of living next to one of these devices or the other. And so we have things that are like these detailed things of, here's a community getting like a host community feed. Here's like sinkage. Here's a methane explosion, methane flare. So this is kind of we're able to kind of like indulge their like dark side and like draw up as many of these kind of possible like negative environmental impacts as they could, and then try to situate them and describe them as how they were related to. Of course, it's kind of like this, kind of broken diagram in a way. If it's supposed to answer the question, which is better landfilling or incineration, it really doesn't. It kind of just like lays you out. So here's a host of different things that you could consider both good or bad about these two different systems. And then sort of the last sort of physical object that we made was this model. There's an organization in New York called Materials for the Arts, which is a wonderful thing. They basically kind of pull things out of the waste stream and warehouse them around the city. And then artists and art educators can go and kind of go shopping through the waste stream and just like pull out materials. So we got a bunch of waste materials from them, had some architectural student friends build out like a topographical map of Fresh Kills, and then we spent a couple of weekends having like barbecues and having the students just kind of like build things, kind of with no real instruction, just sort of like after they arrived at the interviews, we kind of wanted to create this space that was kind of like the kind of like subconscious dumping ground of like material that they'd accumulated through the course of all this interview and research. And so, they built all these structures, and then we had them, draw pictures of them, and then come up with like stories about them. And so, kind of through this means, we sort of produced our own kind of entry into the Fresh Hills competition. And the way that this operated, don't show that. Yeah, well, I can just show that. So, I mean, it really became this place where, like, a lot of very dark kind of fantasies about how they themselves fit into the garbage infrastructure kind of fit together. Because after spending, like, a fair amount of time talking to environmental justice advocates and seeing, the way that, someone from Browning Ferris Industries, like someone who's like a waste hauler, might talk about the problem of garbage, and how someone like Omar Freya, who was an advocate who at that time was at Sustainable South Bronx, would talk about how he felt his community was basically being like treated as a dumping ground. Most of these students who were themselves from low-income communities of color kind of internalized this like very dark sense of like how they fit into the garbage landscape. And so the story that kind of eventually kind of came out of this model building and kind of utopia, dystopia exercise, and again, like really not directed by us as like, it should be this or that, it's sort of like build something and then like write about what it is that you build. Became this like really kind of funny, ultimately kind of utopian, but mostly very dark story about how all of the poor and minority residents of New York City would eventually be sent to live on Fresh Kills. But how they managed to build this kind of like amazing society out of garbage. So there's all these sort of different monuments. This was the Picky Man Hotels. This is a monument. That's just a Giuliani. And it's sort of like this kind of like monument to like Giuliani like shitting on New York was like this kind of statue that they built. There's like this kind of
guy getting lynched in the background.
I forget. What does it say? Mike? Maybe that's Bloomberg? I don't know who that. I'm not sure about that, but that's pretty dark though, yeah. This is sort of a leachate swimming pool. And then kind of we built this sort of like big graphic of like explaining all the components. And then set that up in a few different places. So this is it installed. And so this kind of like dystopian model of like, how it would feel about garbage. So then the last component of this was that the students also made a 30-minute film about kind of the trash politics, and then moderated a panel discussion between, this guy's name is Tom Outerbridge. He's like a recycling kind of fanatic, but he's also sort of like this weird dynastic son of Staten Island. There's one of the bridges is called Outerbridge that takes you to New Jersey. That's his dad's like bridge. So he started as a recycling missionary. There's this woman, Leslie Lowe, who's an amazing environmental justice lawyer. We had the legal counsel to the city council on recycling and garbage issues, and we had the mayor of New Jersey coming out. And actually at this event was when, the day that they announced that they were going to reinstate recycling, so it was sort of like this big triumphant day. And so through that work, essentially, not through this work in particular, but the video that we produced ended up being something that was used for about 2 or 3 years by a bunch of different environmental justice organizations to explain kind of the problems about the way that the waste transfer stations were set up in the city. And I'm going to go back to that slide. Okay, yeah. So instead of, at that point, sort of like the main advocacy point that all these environmental justice organizations were working towards was transferring from a truck system to a barge system. And barging was used very infrequently up to that point. Just a couple of the transfer stations, departed by barge. But what ended up happening, which is kind of like an amazing outcome, is that through all that advocacy, they did actually reform the solid waste management plan so that they shut down quite a few of the transfer stations and set up these kind of 8 macro barging sites that are pretty much equitably distributed throughout the city. And there's one like pretty close to Gracie Mansion. So it sort of like is a positive story that there are better and worse ways to organize garbage systems, and they have differing effects on communities. So it wasn't an experience overall for us of something that was like sort of like this entropic feeling of making something better one place, just like make something worse in another. But in fact, you can actually organize infrastructure in better and worse ways. So I think I'm just going to stop there. Yeah. Cool. The project I'll talk about my stray shopping project, and then a little bit at the end about a more recent project that I'm working on. Just deals with waste, actually, in sort of a completely different way. But this project started back in, it's really, I don't work too much on this anymore, but it started back in 1999. So back in 1999, 2000, I was driving through an intersection of Hurdle and Delaware, and I just noticed there were shopping carts everywhere. Like they tipped over upside down, in yards, you left at bus stops. And I thought there's something interesting going on with shopping carts. But I thought if I were just to go take pictures of them in these weird situations, it would really kind of only read in one way, which would be this kind of sad document of sort of urban life, or sort of the emotional tone would just be sort of one thing. So I decided that what would be more interesting is to find what's actually happening in shopping carts. How do they get where they are? How do they move around? Like what is this world of the shopping cart? And so I decided to sort of approach it like a naturalist, where I was going to go out and observe what I could observe, and sort of try to figure out what are the different states the shopping cart is in and passes through, where does it come from, where do they end up? So that it started very small. I started up this division between Class A, false strays. Those are carts that go out from the store to the front and then return. And then Class B, true strays, which are the carts that go out and never come back. So it started very small, just a few different ones in the category, and eventually grew to what you see here, which is 33 subtypes of these two categories. But my approach, so all my projects are these sort of investigations of the world, mostly sort of mundane, trying to sort of just explore these peripheral spaces in the world that we live in. In this case, it's the urban environment. In my current project, it's much more about sort of architectural spaces and these sort of peripheral, the corners of rooms and the animals that live there. So I always, in this case, I usually, in doing this, almost do like a character. So when I investigate shopping carts, and Just do this. I sort of think of this, I sort of create this character as this guy who takes this subject extremely seriously, and I write from that point of view, and I investigate trying to figure out from that point of view. And in this case, it's really this guy, whatever, who's the other Julian Montague, is using a taxonomy. So his concern is how to name these cards, how to give language to define these different states, shopping states and shopping criteria. And it's sort of a very judgment-free thing. I don't make any value judgments about the social forces that create the situation, about what these do to the environment, or anything else like that. And in that sense, for me as the artist, it's just the real Julian Montague. I also I'm not interested in making art where I'm making those kinds of activist sort of statements. I kind of want to be free of that when I'm exploring this thing, because I'm sort of going in without these preconceptions about what a shopping cart, what role it serves. And I think a lot of people like my work because they see it as, being about consumerism or being capitalism, all these other sorts of things. But the way I see it is I'm more interested in this almost, this natural system, this sort of ecology of the shopping, the way it sort of moves. I'm not, I just want to know what's happening. I find it fascinating. And part of this project is about giving language by sort of naming this thing, which is just before it's like, oh, there's a shopping cart. And now this elaborate system of terms, the viewer then sees shopping carts, so they can see them. So it's the power of kind of giving language to something that was not articulated before. And that the process became interesting to me in the way that many people see things that they didn't see before. And almost against the wall. So that when people see this project, then they come to me afterwards and say, now I see shopping carts everywhere. So this thing, just by knowing that someone, even if it's kind of crazy, this absurd art project, has taken the time to give names to these different shopping carts, that changes their point of view. And I'm sort of interested in that process. But let me just take you through what I mean by the language. Okay, so I'll just quickly go through and explain these states are. So like a closed false is like a straight cart that is like at the edge of the parking lot that it's named, which I call like a source. So when I use the word source, that means any store that shopping carts come from. Plaza drift is a cart that sort of has been moved by whatever forces, by connected concrete, in a sort of plaza situation. And all of these have a list of things that define them. And I should say also, the notion here, and this has been published as a book, like the field guide to straight shopping carts. The idea is that there are all these different states that a shopping cart can occupy, and you go and you find a cart, you can apply these. So it could be, there's a combination, so it could be an A2, it could also be an A4 damaged cart at the same time. So you're just trying to put together these terms to sort of label it and therefore identify it. Bus stop discard, so people take this stuff to the bus and then leave the shopping cart. You can see people that's sitting on the side of it, so it's sort of a bench. A4 damage sources are carts that have been smashed by trucks or even certain counters with cars. Damaged groups is when they put the broken carts together behind the store. And these are all class A, so these are all carts that are around the places they're from and are going backward. Cloud crush is sort of a different category for snow incidents because it's so kind of completely violent. Fragments at source, which is less than 50% of the original. Mixed group is where a lot of times people will take shopping carts that are sort of around, and just to get them out of the way, they put them at whatever the nearest parking lot is. So you'll find these groups that all gathered together. These are all from different stores, not necessarily this plaza. Remote false, and this is one that you can't really ever know, but it's a cart that will return to its source, but it's very far away. It's like like a half mile away from its source. Alternative usage is where stores use carts for other things. In this case, it's to keep the drain from getting plowed in. So you see this sort of thing quite a lot. False group. This is when there's an apartment building near a grocery store. So what will happen is all the people will just take their stuff from the store, leave them at the apartment building, and then someone from the store will, grudgingly come by and take the carts back. So then into Class B true states, which is the more interesting and complex size. Open true is a little bit like remote false, where it's just a card that's out there, and you can sort of transition to any of the other Class B states. Damaged, it's a card damaged by, in any sort of situation. This one is actually by the Armory on Connecticut Street. I think it might have actually been hit by like one of their huge military vehicles. Let's see it happen. B3 fragment, so that's, again, like the fragment we saw at the source lot. On as personal property, now this is the one that actually encompasses an awful lot of different things. Like this would include appropriation by the homeless. This includes just anybody who's taking a card for their personal usage. In this case, this is like my father-in-law's garage in Williamsville. We used to find a card on the street and we used to move stuff around. You often find in apartment buildings or shopping carts to take the laundry to the basement, that sort of thing. And one of the things that a lot of people associate shopping carts with homeless people. And in actually like looking into this phenomenon, like that is just an infinitesimal part of what happens with shopping carts. Like there's maybe it's the most visible thing in a way, but the shopping cart is this incredible. It's very strange. There's nothing like it, where it sort of is so useful in so many different ways, and yet it's sort of almost free. Where, it's accessible to the kind of a decriminalized thing to like appropriate one. So it's not. You see plastic bags and things like that sort of have this life where they fly around and they get attached to things and they're everywhere. But the shopping cart is useful, and it can be like in my father-in-law's garage, he probably put it out on the street and somebody else took it and did something with it. It just kind of goes from place to place. On as business properties, like this is a thrift store using it to hold records. So like that's a store using a cart for some other purpose than to have people shop with it. Assimilated is where a cart from a different store gets sort of into the herd of another store. This is usually in like poorly managed stores in first-grade suburbs. Transient imposter is sort of a card that's just kind of crossing, it's sort of the plaza drift, but sort of more free. Structurally modified, because shopping carts are so well made, they're often like, you will find them, this is not an example of that, but you will often find them sawed off, and you find the top, and it's like a clean saw marks on the lower struts, where people have taken the lower part to make a cart for like a machine shop or something. They sort of just a garage to carry stuff around, and they well on some new thing. This, it has like lawnmower wheels in the back, and there was something like, the back frame was cut out, and so it was clearly like repurposed for something, but what, I don't know. Snowballization is sort of a transition to this sort of state where the snow sort of freezes things and allows these transitions into other Class B states. Plow crush, like what we said before, but it's when a cart is not native to the lot. Train damaged is very, it's when a cart gets hit by a train, it's a pretty complete destruction, so it gets its own category. And you'll find that when you go by the railroad tracks in any kind of urban area, they sort of blend into the environment pretty quickly, especially the metal ones, because they rust. But they're there. You'll find these fragments, the stones. Simple vandalism is basically an impulsive act. So it's sort of a two-step thing, where someone sees a card and they do something like this, or they sort of like push it down the embankment, something along those lines. Complex vandalism is like 3 or more steps. So that would be like, in this case, it's like you're appropriating the card, you're lifting it over the fence, you're getting it into the empty pool. So it's like, it requires, you have to, it requires effort as part of it. Montague is a card from a store that's closed down, but it's still out there. And you find the cards in good condition that have been out, for years. They've probably been in someone's garage for 15 years, and then they just put them back out again. So there's this concept of gaps in the gap spaces in the project, where it's kind of like sort of like vacant lots, and it's kind of like no man's land. Some places like the Skajaka Creek, where it's a park, I guess, but it's a sort of zones where people get rid of things for one thing. You often find these in places like that also have where people throw away their mattresses and tires and things you can't easily throw out. So you find them piled up in these zones. And gap marginalization is this way to just get rid of the car. It's in their parking lot, so they want to get rid of it, so they put it somewhere. Although in this case, in this photograph, actually, they're probably using it in a couple of different ways. But let's go that way. Edge modulation is also where you just throw it over the fence to get rid of it. Which is like I found like on near the Boulevard Mall, I wasn't seeing any carts anywhere, and then I looked over this fence and I found just a pile of them. So it's just like people just throwing them over this fence into this whatever gap space is no man's land. Remote group, similar to the mixed group, but you're just out. As a reference receptacle, if you leave a cart around as there's any people around, it will just immediately, people will fill it with trash. And then as refuse, so the end state for many carts is that they become thrown out themselves into this waste stream. Also, when you have these carts that are sort of in these gap spaces, when those get redeveloped, oftentimes they just get sort of plowed under, they become sort of go back into the earth, which is also what this state is. So that's also this like naturalization, which is where, a cart is, we throw them into water, basically when you put them in a geotechnical situation, they get kind of covered up with dirt or soil, or just kind of, in a place where they are part of the kind of natural environment, I guess, I would say. And the last one is wheel lock straight. So this is, there are all these locking mechanisms, which are really kind of, as I was really stopping working a lot on the project, these were kind of coming in, so I haven't really done a lot of work with them, but some of them, the different mechanisms, some of them, this was like 2 miles from where it came from, so some of them, if you push hard enough and long enough, I think it'll start turning, or you just push it on the 3 wheels and it just kind of skids. And then other like weird things, this is in Copenhagen, where they had, at least at the time, about 8 or 9 years ago, there was a free bicycle system that used a coin deposit. I think now there's a credit card system, but like a coin deposit, when you put a key in, and the key unlocks the bicycle, and you get your coin back, and you lock it up in a rack. It's the same mechanism that was used on shopping carts at one of the grocery stores. So people would take the cart, take the grocery store wherever, and then get the coin back by locking it to a bike rack, which is what's happening here. And this is also B18 as a refuse receptacle as well. So this is how I sort of have these maps. Like these are different, two different carts journeys. Like one is a false straight where it goes out and it transitions. It's close false, and then it goes to positive drift. Then it becomes close false again, and then it's returned to the source. Actually, no, 3 journeys here. So another one, it's a B1 open true. It's then it's on as personal property, someone's appropriated it. Then the storage fund closes down, it becomes archaic. Then it holds that archaic status as it then becomes like a B7 transit imposter and joins an A18 group. So it's sort of, it gets complicated. And this is, I do think all of this stuff this system is true. Do you know what I mean? It's all, none of it's made up. None of the photographs are fake. Like everything it works. It's just no one probably needs it. Right? And these sorts of, but I took great pains to make sure that it actually is this sort of functioning system. So you can, it has rules, but it also has these areas where you can't know. Like you can't know for sure what a card came out unless you were tracking it in some way, unless you were watching it. So I guess, like I was saying, I'm sort of like, the great thing doing this project, like I went into it without strong feelings about what these cards meant. Do you know what I mean? And that was, agnosticism actually kind of got, as I spent the strange thing is spending all this time in these spaces that no one really ever goes to, you get really used to it. So it feels more and more natural to find the cards there. And it is its own kind of ecology. Do you know what I mean? Like, including like the mattresses and the tires and all of these things. It's a place like this, Jackrabbit Creek. It is this. There is this cycle of like, human activity that is entirely predictable, just like all of the natural activity of the animals and the plants and so forth. So on some level, I guess I'd like to entertain that idea of this being its own sort of ecology. Obviously, it's negative. On some level, and I know that cards in of themselves don't do any particular environmental damage. I guess maybe kill this tree in some way. But in general, do you know what I mean? I think they're a fairly neutral presence. So it's much more kind of like what it means in social terms for people to see them there, you know, and often do these acts of negligence or vandalism or I don't know, but when you spend all this time in those places, then you kind of almost like those places. It sort of feels right. When I would go do studies or go to look for shopping carts in different cities, you basically just look at the map, and you look for a grocery store, and you look for, you know, a body of water, and then if it's nearby, you will find shopping carts in there. So, you know, on some level, there's the same, you know, same in Europe and wherever else I've been. It is a sure thing. Do you know what I mean? So there's something that is a human impulse to just take something and throw it into the water. You know, it's probably, you know, people were probably throwing rocks in the water, you know, 40,000 years ago. So in some weird way, I guess what I'm saying is I don't necessarily see it as a sign of, you know, the breakdown of society and so forth. You know what I mean? I think it's much more complicated than that. And that's what I want to do with this project is, I wanted to say, because the shopping cart, if it was a symbol of any of the stray shopping cart, if it was a symbol of anything, it was kind of a symbol of, you know, kind of urban decay and black noise. I really want to just find out how complicated the shopping cart is. And it's very complicated. It is this object that exists, you know, in a way that no other kind of object exists. And it's neither, you know, positive or negative, it just sort of is, you know, it is what it is. But these are just a few other. And there's an enormous diversity. Like I said, none of these are anything I ever posed. I basically never touched a cart to reposition it in any way. There's just no need. You know, you just would find these situations. And this is another example of, you know, the useful, you know, utility. Where this is chain padlocked to keep people from the driveway. And there's an example of, you know, as personal property, these apartments are, keeps the carts in the balcony. And probably fun. This is another example of gouges. You can see the tires there. We often find we find strange things. You know, we have these like zones where people can throw out what they can't get rid of other ways. Like this area, which is actually behind now, it's Big Lots on Delaware. But at the time, it was closed down. So I think it might have been around the time I shot this, someone had dumped like a motorboat without the engine in the same area. And it was called, the name of the boat, you know, this really badly put on, you know, letters. It was called Mama's Frustration. The name of the boat, and clearly, you know, Mama was frustrated because she ended up having to dump the boat in the parking lot in North Buffalo. So, but so one of the weird things that I found was like, it was actually on this projector because this cart had been like kind of crushed by a tree that had been chewed down by a beaver, and then someone else right next to it had like thrown like the body of a large dog in a trash bag like down the embankment. So it was just this weird sort of, I don't know, it's a very strange scene of nature and man-made kind of disasters happening at the same time. And there's waste. But the shopping cart is interesting. It's hard to know how to talk about it in this sort of waste stream. And then, I mean, obviously, in one sense, it's like this, where it ends up, you know, being thrown out. But then it is this way that people move waste at times. Or, you know, I think it's a very kind of complex relationship in that system. But like, there's a good example. Or this is also like edge marginalization. People just, it's by the train, what used to be train tracks. And right at you see there's a fence there. So it's just like every stray car they wanted to get rid of, they just up here and just pile on. It's low vandalism. But here's something where someone's trying to just get all this like bricks and garbage because it's too much for the shopping cart there. Like I mentioned, Skidjack Creek, where he did a study of Skidjack where sort of pinpointed all the different places. And sort of like, it's really a great place for this sort of thing because you've got college, high school, you've got all this traffic, all these stores, like everything kind of works together to make it a place where you're just constantly present. People throwing shopping carts into the creek. But I also find Skidjack an interesting place too because it's, you know, it is a very polluted
waterway, but it's also just incredibly full of life. So it's a very, and like I was saying before, this kind of ecology of human, sort of system of human trash and stuff that's working in my sort of impression of it. It starts to take on this weird, like, natural feeling of this kind of hybrid space. But anyway, obviously, there are a lot of photographs attached to this project, so hundreds of them. But when I show the project, this is like this, where I sort of pull the language out and put it on the walls and kind of make these connections. And it is deliberately complicated, deliberately obscure. But it's been interesting to see when I show it, people really do take the time to read it. And most people find it funny because it is so serious. I mean, it's written in such a serious way that it becomes absurd. And I think a lot of people see in the photographs tend to anthropomorphize the cards and see them as sort of like human things or tragic situations. And I mean, that's, for me, like the project is just this sort of conceptual idea of, dealing with language and sort of investigating the environment, but also each individual photograph, I think, has to have its own kind of emotional value to succeed as art. So that's that project. I just wanted to touch on my other project briefly, because it sort of has started to deal with waste a little bit. My second project was sort of, I'm still working on it, working for the last several years, but the way I was investigating kind of peripheral space in the urban environment, I wanted to take inside the domestic sphere, or inside buildings. So I started with spiders, and sort of by collecting spiders, in the actual killers or in the jars. And then looking at them through a microscope and making a portrait, to make a drawing of their face, and then I'd make a fabric banner which I would then hang up in the place where I found the spider. And then photograph that whole scene. And then so that banner would become this kind of like ironic memorial to the spider that sort of had to die for me to see it well enough to draw it, and also this like marker of its presence. So there's a whole series of photographs along these lines, which then grew into, and spiders are everywhere. They're in this room, they're everywhere. They're a constant, they're a constant presence. They live around us in this sort of like, sometimes it's a symbiotic relationship, sometimes it isn't. It's a very sort of, I'm sort of fascinated by the way that they occupy the spaces that we don't physically live in. Like the corner of the room that you don't ever actually put your hand into it. But often sort of invisible as you see with the right angle. Many spiders can be there for years. They can sit there for 9 months and not eat anything and survive. This is going to a large question about the kind of abandoned buildings, and I made these banners to represent the kind of animals that live in, would take over an abandoned building, kind of turn the interior space into exterior space, both physically and conceptually. So that includes like birds and animals, and these all went down into like a map in the middle, kind of showed the layout of a house, a wooden house that's sort of being taken apart. And this is at the Birchfield, which some of you may have seen. So the project then came to the sort of fictional investigator that I had at the center of the shopping project. I sort of moved into having kind of the same idea in this project, although it's a much stranger fictional character. So, and then I've now strayed into actual fiction where where I've been making these sort of reading material for this character. So I make these books, just the covers of books, and put them in old libraries that look real. Kind of imagining that, like in the middle of the last century, with this idea of how animals, particularly invertebrates, dealt with architecture is really important. So I thought I'd just keep making these books that kind of basically relate to ideas that I'm interested in, and the way I use these books in a show, I use it to, it's almost like taking these things I want to put into the mind of the viewer for them to take to the work. I put them in these fake books so they kind of, and with the fake books, even if you know it's fake, and unfortunately most people don't even know they're fake, so that's another complicated thing. But you have to, it makes you have to like, kind of wonder what's in that book. Do you know what I mean? And I love being able to like just design this thing and then imply all this other information, which I have not to create. But so this is an ongoing, and there's also fictional fiction. This is an existential novel. But yeah, but they're like I think 35 titles now in this series. But so anyway, what I'm getting to is I'm doing a site-specific project that's opening next week no, these don't look good on the screen. Well, so there's a large warehouse space in Hamilton, Ontario, where people have been invited to do installations. So I went up and I photographed all these cobwebs, like disused spider webs, in the space that was shown, and then I'm projecting them in this small dark room. It's off in the space. I made them into slides, like analog slides. So unfortunately, it's not coming. It's kind of burning out a little bit. But so what I find interesting about what's interesting about this is I'm interested from a couple of different ways. One is that I'm sort of introducing this, these like little landscapes and little spaces that you sort of never see otherwise. And I'm manipulating the color and stuff and actually inverting them so you can see them a little bit better. But then the other thing is that these spiders are leaving these things behind, and they actually still have the power to kill a lot of these webs, which, like here you can see like their insects actually like stuck in there. So it is this kind of waste of the spider. They make these elaborate webs and snares, and then either they get eaten or they wander off, they make another web that's not succeeding with the web because of the enzymes and spider webs. They don't break down very easily, so they're there for quite a long time. So you'll find these webs with, it's hard to see this is an example. But with these clusters of bugs, they've not been eaten, they're just sort of caught. So it's this weird kind of way in which the spider is creating its own kind of waste and its own environmental damage on some level. I mean, obviously this is all within an entire ecosystem. It's sort of a stripped down. It's like the spiders are in a kind of desert in a way where they're building these webs. But yes, I'm kind of in this context. It's interesting to think about that kind of what they leave behind. Then you can see that it's like a wing, all these chunks of both. Anyway, that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you.
Before I want to satisfy my kind of structuralist impulse to summarize what I see in the way that trash is being visualized here, I want to just say that for me it's very difficult to enter into this just because of the nature of trash as this very complex system. And so when the first panel tried to deal with that by looking at objecthood and the kind of tension inherent in that between, let's say, the object and the process that somehow brings together or in some way represents to us. And the second group of presentations try to deal with that by looking at experience, and I think there's this kind of tension between experience on the one hand and value on the other, as a way to think through the kind of capitalist system production that kind of is part of. Then I think here, what for me really strikes me as the kind of term to hold this together is not so much visualizing information or visualizing trash, but rather the notion of knowledge or expertise. Because for me, engaging with trash is about how you engage with these very complex systems that are a matter of very different and often isolated and secretive ways of expertise. And so I think while I think you do a very good job in being kind of the non-expert expert of trash, right, where you kind of come up with this very expert system, right, of classification, but at the same time also obviously have a kind of ironic stance towards that, towards the kind of idiosyncrasies of that system. I think in your case there's much more of an emphasis on how do we engage with expertise from the perspective of, let's say, a high school student, right, and how does the knowledge that we gain from that feed into another system, right? How does that knowledge circulate in society? And for me, I really like that approach, because I was just recently being mesmerized, I guess, by John Dewey and his book, The School and Society, which is very much a way to think through these questions of how does an educational system really contribute to society at large, and how can we really achieve some kind of ethics of involvement or engagement through through the school as an institution, and not so much as a way to kind of reflect on society or bringing this knowledge of society, but rather the circulation of knowledge in society, and therefore the engagement and the relationship of the school as an institution with society. And so, for me, then the question is really art versus education, if I may put you in different camps here. And then also relating to that, what are the different kinds of publics, the different kinds of institutions, and access to knowledge that comes with it. And for me, it's a matter of pragmatics, of how you access that knowledge, and what the ultimate goal is. I think that's something that we haven't touched on directly in the first, this morning, I think, in the sense that we've just tried to grapple with these very difficult concepts. But for me, it's very important why we're sitting here on a Saturday, right? And why we as non-experts, I assume most of you, non-experts of the waste system are interested in, and what your kind of stake in it is. And therefore, for me, it's a question of the ethics of knowledge, really, as you engage with these systems that are very much beyond our understanding. I don't know if that's a question.
It's like that Julian sketch.
And I can certainly say something. Do you want to? No, please. So that, I mean, definitely all the things you brought out are things that I think about pretty frequently in my work, and certainly are things that are really embodied by CUP and the work that they do. You know, I think that, you know, one of the things that you brought up sort of this idea of trying to inhabit this character that is interested in stuff that is not yourself. And in a way, I feel like I feel very similarly about my own research, and what I try to engender as an educator is trying to, we use the technical term of tripping out a lot at CUP, trying to get our students to be like, we should really just trip out on this. And just kind of getting to a point where you are just genuinely kind of like have this kind of, I feel like it's a very visceral feeling of being overwhelmed by the kind of like the system and like all these different components of it, where you're actually reordering the way you can understand your everyday experience. And so, you know, it's kind of a metaphor, sometimes we use a sort of kind of model space, and when you spend too much time building your model, and then you start walking around in the real world, like suddenly you're like, whoa, like you kind of have this like radical disorientation to things you otherwise didn't see. And I think that that's a big part of what, you know, what I try to produce. You know, another piece of that is that it kind of goes with, and I present some of these things as like formulated like ideas, like, oh, I did it this way on purpose, and a lot of it is sort of retroactive. Like we did a lot of things, and then after several years of figuring them out, we can kind of use them and figure out what we're doing. But there's a lot of ways in which, you know, high school students are kind of the ideal kind of fake person to inhabit in terms of trying to understand how like city politics works. Because you have sort of the right level of feeling like the world should be a certain way, and it's not, and yet still sort of like all the kind of critical capacity to like actually start asking those questions, and none of like the embarrassment that you should already know the answers to them. So in a lot of ways, like we produce stuff, like we kind of aim for our work to be like understandable by high school students because it's made by high school students, and that ended up being like a really important kind of part of like both the process and the products. Because I think that there is something about, yeah, the adults when they encounter things about like how basic aspects of the political system or infrastructure work, they don't know, but they still sort of feel like, well, if I don't know by now, I'm probably just kind of an idiot, and everyone else probably already knows this, or something like that. And in fact, like very few people know anything about how their trash system works, and kind of being enabled to have that mindset is really, really useful. And then I guess the last thing I'd say on that point that came to mind is just in the relationship between art and education. Is that, I think part of, again, why some of the products that we produced in our high school investigations worked the way they did in terms of being useful to community organizations that were not speaking to like an audience of like pre-self-defined nerds or something like that, like people who would go to a gallery show about infrastructure. is that students, in terms of figuring out, well, this is going to be interesting to you. If you can figure out a weird enough way to represent this, and that it will sustain your interest, it'll probably sustain the interest of someone who does not think of themselves as being interested in infrastructure. So there's like many different kinds of barriers to people kind of feeling, interested and invested in understanding these systems. And I think that they're trying to approach it through kind of a lens of producing an object that is interesting to investigate, as opposed to trying to produce a fully complete didactic system. Sometimes it's a much more effective way of producing like an educational tool.
Well, I guess what are the ethics for you of doing this kind of work? And what does it tell us about trash? How does it make us? That's a very good question. What's the kind of redistribution of the sensible? I think that was mentioned before that term. That your work engages in other words.
I don't know. I guess, like I was saying, I try to, I guess I'm coming at it from, or my point of view is I'm sort of doing these investigations of these mundane. I want to sort of illuminate these mundane things that are, from an art perspective. Generally, I sort of want to find what's kind of interesting in these things that appear normal or what's strange in sort of everyday. And what that, I think, well, I guess what I'm saying is I think that the sort of the ethics, the information that I then ended up creating out of that impulse, in the case of the shopping cart thing, I think that, I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that it's a goal-oriented in the sense of transmitting a certain message. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to expose and explain in this interesting way this thing is happening. And then you can take that information, and interpret it any way that you want to. So some people see this as like, some people see this as anthropomorphized kind of bodies and this is, how society treats people. There are all these sorts of things in the way that the way that it's a form of pollution, sort of trash. And I think that people, that information is there, and I do think I do reveal like kind of the mechanisms, of how this works. But I don't set out with a goal that I want to communicate a certain, I have a goal. I want you to walk away knowing that you need to put that card back in the rack.
Yeah. I think in your case also probably the question should be to the audience rather than trying to reveal the intentionality of the architect. I think the redistribution of the sensible should take place in your heads and in your bodies rather than in that of the stated intention, right? So maybe that's a segue into the floor unless you want to.
No. Yeah, I do think it's like if I wanted to, I have views on, I have my own personal views on a lot of these different things, on issues, environmental issues, all these other things. But in the artwork, I want it to be, especially like using this kind of character where this guy just cares about how it sort of fits together. Like, I think that's what makes it work, is that I'm not injecting, anything directly. It's there that you can sort of take that. You can take what I presented and sort of draw your own conclusions about what it says about the system.
Yeah. Well, I guess for why I asked the question initially is just because if we have like you representing art, you representing education, capital letters. Because obviously it's not that simple. But if that's the case, then of course this approach tells us something about different modes of thinking about education, different ways of thinking about art, and how that may relate to different traditions within art, etc. But my question is, what does it tell us about trash and the way we deal with that?
Well, sort of. Sorry.
I just have a question about what you think about the idea of the small. In your case, you were talking about the shopping cart is never. It's not like doing anything. It doesn't contribute to. It's not like it's like taking over the world and all this stuff. But people associate it symbolically with derelict and like all this stuff. And in your case, in a lot of the way the high school students work, they sort of understand and comprehend and other things have to do with symbols as well. So I'm wondering if you could say about that and your roles.
Interesting question. Because I think of myself as someone who's not very interested in this at all. But what you say doesn't seem false. Yeah, and like, oh yeah, I guess I mean like, for the students there is quite a bit in terms of especially like their kind of the garbage city landscape. A lot of what they brought to that was like very specific instances kind of reassembled as like these are symbols of how we feel the garbage system like treats us or how we feel like related to it. And it does proceed in that kind of project. I mean, typically what I think of most of work is as different kinds of like really specific kinds of abstraction. So really not dealing with dealing with a documentary and dealing with ways to abstract that in really structured ways. And I'd say in some ways, the way that you kind of built this taxonomy, it's also kind of a project about kind of making it look into kind of abstraction. But the symbolic dimension, yeah, I kind of stumped about what to say about that, honestly. Except for that, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this a lot.
I mean, yeah, as I was sort of saying, I think the shopping cart is this iconic thing. It's a symbolic thing. One that's where it's not supposed to be is the symbol of, sort of society gone off the rails, and then even a normal shopping cart is the symbol of consumers. It has all this, it carries all of this with it. And really, my project is like trying to undermine, it's trying to like take it apart, to just destroy, I want to undo what it's supposed to be. Because I just want to show it as being this very complex thing. It's not. It doesn't mean. I guess it doesn't mean what you think it means. So of course that doesn't make any sense. But I just want to like. I guess I'm just. The note. I don't like the way the shopping cart functions as. So. I'm trying to like just.
Parallel that is really interesting in modern presentation. The shopping cart, as you point out, is something that maybe we don't tend to see, or we see in one way, when you're with the taxonomy, you're showing it in another way. I think the idea of looking at a design competition as a political act as opposed to a neutral act, or even a purely positive act, I tend to think of a design competition as something that's going to bring innovation and bring design energy to something that otherwise might not have that. And so I can almost imagine a taxonomy of design competitions where you see
Kenny asked what this all says about trash, and so my first thought was how it will work, at least the way that the work is organized around shopping carts. That project is so much about sorting, and so much of what we've already talked about today has to do with the taxonomies of trash and sorting trash physically and mentally and financially and so many other ways. That already starts to pull the threads at the seams between art and education, because there is a kind of inherently didactic quality to that. And I think also it reminds me of how Adrian, maybe kind of tongue-in-cheek, described his work as being anachronistic, because there's something very Victorian to me about this enterprise of making a whole genealogy of the shopping cart, the wandering shopping cart. I've been working with students this semester on the design of an addition to the Victorian Botanical Gardens building here. And so they're fully exposed to how everything is genus, then species, then this, then that, then the other thing. There is something of that logic that seems present there. And where I become curious, and I think it's somehow related, but I can't figure it out, maybe it'll occur to you, but the method, the uses of graphics in both of your works is not just prominent, but you both share an interest or an involvement in uses of maybe pictograms or something that has a little bit of, to me, it's a particular world of graphics, and it has a really rich history, I would say, in Otto Eicher on the one hand, and someone like Milton Glaser on the other. And I don't surmise that these guys are necessarily present in either of your thinking, but I would love to hear about how that plays into the way you're thinking about the work, is the graphic organization of it.
well, for me, like it was, what I'm really trying to do with the design is I've been trying to create this authoritative voice. Do you know what I mean? So if I were to do this project and it was all like handwritten, labeled photographs, then it would be much more in the realm of like, here's the work of a madman kind of thing, and it would just, the whole tone. Yeah, maybe, which may be interesting in its own way, but it wouldn't be, like by designing it and making it seem like authoritative, like here it is, and like it gives it this air of being real, of being serious. So I think that for me, the design, and I'm very interested in like field guides, as the idea of the book as being this way, this way that one understands and sees the world. So like that, I was following that kind of model to some degree. So it was all about, but yeah, it was tone. It's just like it's like making that voice serious.
Yeah, it's interesting the relationship between, because I think that there's this. I approach like diagramming and the use of isotype or things like that, like graphical systems, in a way that's like I feel like I really try to connect with like an unironic, kind of self-conscious use of those things, and when I feel like my work is working really well is when I feel like I'm actually trying to diagram the system and make it as an accurate and like useful a representation system as I can. Because the world is actually so complicated that if you really try to like produce a system that can graphically describe something, you're eventually going to end up with something that is sort of like crazy looking, because there is so much complexity there. So I feel like I generally am trying to when I feel like I'm doing my best work, I feel like I'm in an earnest space of trying to actually like diagram without trying to like make it look in a particular style. And yet it's still becoming something that's like slightly beyond my control and like is like kind of like spilling out in this way, if that makes sense. And obviously there's like a lot of iteration and refinement. But that is sort of how I approach producing diagrams. Sort of like a retroactive, like hero of mine is out of Nordat, who is this Vietnamese designer who's mostly known for kind of creating like the symbols people use in like airports and restaurants and stuff like that, but like precursors to that. And that's very much like a style now. That there's like this isotype style. Like isotype was the international system of typographic picture education, and it's a graphic style to have like little whatever abstracted do. But that whole language was produced as part of like a larger system of political education. He was an anarchist economist, and he was involved in trying to develop these like museums for the working people to communicate different techniques of how to create like a barter economy during wartime. And so he also like the progenitor of the Natural History Museum and all these kinds of things. He's one of the first people to kind of try to produce a museum of the present and create museum structure, but through the use of diagrams and representation of the existing economy instead of artifacts and objects, like trying to actually use museum for this other purpose besides kind of like a safe house of culture. So how can we actually use this as a sharing space for building alternate economies? And so it's kind of amazing that this kind of like weird like little thing that's become like sort of a very like stock style actually has this like really kind of amazing and beautiful, ultimately kind of failed trajectory as like this kind of like the system. So I think of myself when I think of myself as a designer as a really kind of unreconstructed like modernist in the sense that I'm trying to actually describe a system as cleanly and clearly as possible. And it just happens that the systems are so complex that they tend to spill out towards this other thing.
It's so great to hear. I just wanted to just say one more word on it, that I actually was trying to coax exactly that outlet because like my example wasn't him, but a kind of cousin, which is this actor guy who did the Munich Olympics, and very, very similar kind of idealism behind it. So it's very interesting to hear that it's not just a choice, but the kind of values behind it that drive you.
I was just going to say, it's just a comment really, but it reminds me of another kind of supposition that John Dewey made, that the quantity or quality of information, or say bad information, or even a kind of low quantity of information is not a hindrance to politics. And I always found that very striking because I think even as a standard in architecture schools of wanting to map everything, students always encounter that problem of suddenly there's this flood of information, which I often say to my students, like, okay, let's try to avoid all the chart crap, right? But it's really how you make sense of it in a way. But I'm also very interested in the sense of approximation and how it seems like that's also what you naturally encounter, even though you're trying to kind of make transparent all these relationships. That it's always a kind of, but yeah.
But I find at the same time the politics here lies not so much in the didacticism, but rather in this kind of naivete almost, or the questions, raising questions and pointing at holes, rather than in visualizing information that's a fact. I think it's the process and the why and how behind how this works. That's where the political dimension of it is, for me at least, less so in the kind of end product, let's say. Right?
Less so what it necessarily makes transparent, but
yeah. And therefore the opacities as much of the transparency.
yeah.
But I think that end product is really important because to that question about what it is to say about trash, a two-pronged thought about your work, and that is, on one hand, what you present says less about trash than it says about the agency of subjective voice, or in your case, your subjective oral voice. But the idea that one can leverage a completely arbitrary, subjectively formed body of information as an operative agent in the world to give voice to others is really productive. So on one hand, it says, I feel this is more about that than trash, and then that says two things to me, which is that trash, it positions trash as yet just one other state of material. So not something special, or waste rather, that it is a different configuration of energy. And as such, we could be looking at anything. So it's more about objects than waste specifically. And I think that's important because that agency of the subjective, the agency of the subjective voice, should not be seen to be specific to a kind of a given state of energy, but rather to any state of energy, any kind of state. So you could do that with shopping carts, whether they have a kind of iconic value or not to you. But I would actually disagree with you. I think your work relies on its iconicity. But you could be done with shopping carts as a kind of trace of economic distribution. It could be seen as a kind of arbitrary movement of wind flows. It could be right. So one could interpret that collection of data in so many different ways, simply because of your own subjective position about it, which I think is really great. And so it doesn't have to say anything about trash yet. It requires trash or waste in order to do that.
Well, I think of the shopping carts as having this agency, right? They have this sort of journey, like they are navigating through this environment and have a story of the beginning and end, sort of unknowable, so that
they have wheels. I mean, they also, but no, but seriously, they have wheels. They're constructing certain materials. They have certain dimensions. That's I find so interesting about them. It makes a lot of those relationships possible.
Yeah, I mean, it is this. Well, like I said, it can. I mean, what I find fascinating about it is like one can't know where this cart has been. I mean, I suppose we could technically figure it, but it could be like this, going on this amazing journey, and be on the train and come back. Who knows? It is this weird form of existence, or this object that journey travels.
One of the things I'm interested in the two talks is that they seem to move in opposite directions. Like Rosten, you started off with your mission statement. It's like there are possibly complex objects, and I want to make them transparent in a sense. And I think you take incredibly simple objects, totally banal objects, and you make them incredibly complex in a sense. So there's a sort of opposite movement in a way, and I think that has a lot to do with the way knowledge is produced through both systems. Like, I mean, it doesn't seem to me that you are constantly interrogating it, like how this simple object works, and you never stray away from the object itself. So you never give us really very much context in the photographs. You don't really I think your movement is like, maybe you start with something like garbage, in a sense, but suddenly we have pictures of the city, we understand the relative implications of things, and so there's this kind of expansion of the objects that you're studying. your single-minded focus on the one object, then I think produces in us, I guess what Kenny was getting at in terms of like, what is the audience's shift or redistribution of in a sense. It forces us to then really think about the questions of what this object facilitates, in a sense, why. Like, you know, you put it in all these places, and then we can build up these narratives about, you know, the alienated pedestrian environment of the suburbs and how people get from these places to their homes, or, you know, why these objects get stolen. They're so expensive, and yet we can waste them so much because there's so much profit produced through their ability to carry so much stuff. Or, you know, like, so through the focus, we're left in this state of like producing a lot of knowledge and thinking a lot about the things that you're looking at. So I'm not trying to suggest that there isn't a lot of thinking on the part of people who encounter cop for sure. There's a lot, but there seems to be two very opposite directions of knowledge production.
All right. Any more?